Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm doing a video which is not going to have a lot of graphics, a little bit boring, on another trophy food deep dive into abalone. So abalone is basically a mollusk or a large sea snail. Culturally, it's important to the Chinese or Asian cultures, and it's always been seen as a delicacy, but probably because of a couple of other factors. One, it's in very limited supply. So in the wild, it actually grows, it attaches to rocks, and there's a lot of kelp around it. So it's very difficult. You have to deep dive in to get it for at least live or seawater abalone. So it's very difficult to get. So that's why there's a limited supply. Two, there are restrictions because it takes so long to grow an abalone. Abalones grow about 1 to 3 cm a year, and the kind of minimum size that you want for an abalone is probably around 9 cm. So most are between 4 and 10 inches, and so it takes about 4 years, 3 or 4 years, for abalone to get to that kind of size. So, again, they have to be able to control the amount of abalone that's taken from the wild. It's found in the cold waters of New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Japan, and the west coast of North America. And sometimes, in terms of people prefer what's the best quality, I think the best quality to price ratio is generally considered South Africa, although about 95% of abalone that's eaten nowadays is farmed. And that's because, just so difficult to keep up with the demand, and also the prices are very expensive. So farmed is a little bit less expensive. Abalone is associated with wealth and prosperity. The Chinese word for abalone, baoyu, is kind of translated is like guaranteed abundance. When you're serving someone abalone, you're wishing them prosperity, and by eating it, you're kind of accepting their well wishes. From a dietary perspective, abalone is a very good source of protein, omega-3 fatty acids, and various vitamins and minerals. And it's also low in saturated fat, but that's not really a reason to eat it. It's for the luxury. Abalone itself has fairly little flavor, but if cooked correctly, the texture is soft and yet chewy. So that's another reason it's very labor intensive to get it, but it's also very labor intensive to prepare it. So the abalone is a mollusk, so you have to kind of shuck it out. Then you have to actually trim it, some of the sides, and then you have to either somehow tenderize it, either by pounding it or by braising it for a long time. So it takes a lot of preparation to get it to that level. Abalone is very filling and it's very porous. So it when you put it in broth or soup, it really soaks up those flavors like kind of a sponge. And therefore, when you get that, you get a very dense thing. It's almost like a dense sponge. So that's why it's also so filling. Generally, people feel that wild abalone has a stronger taste and is larger due to its natural growth. It usually has a little bit of that kind of sea kind of taste to it, or saltiness, whereas farm abalone is softer. It's going to be a milder taste, and it's more consistent in size. So let's talk about actually how it's measured. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about heads, right? The size of the head, the size of the abalone is a 40 head abalone or 30 or 5 head abalone. So basically a head is a traditional measurement in Southeast Asia of a catty, and a catty is about 600 mLs. And so it's the number of abalone that would fit into a 600 ml kind of jar. And so, for instance, if it's a 5 head, that means there would be 5 abalones that would fit into that jar. So there's a larger. If it's 40, that means it'll be smaller. So generally, the higher the number, the bigger the abalone and the more expensive it's going to be. And generally, that's a measure of dried abalone, not of fresh abalone. Live abalone or fresh abalone, and that can either be farmed or, actually from the sea. And then there's also dried abalone. And dried abalone is generally more expensive. And of the two, fresh abalones, of course, the farmed abalone is going to be less expensive. Why is dried abalone more expensive? Well, it has different, when it's dried, it has different taste textures. It's generally the flavors are more concentrated. And also, of course, when you actually put it in broth, it actually expands. So let's say a 40 head dried abalone, when it expands, might become, let's say, a 20, equivalent to a 20 head fresh abalone. And also, I guess the other thing is that it's more coveted because dried abalone, of course, can be stored and sometimes can be stored for many years, whereas, of course, fresh abalone can't be, so it's not as useful. And because it's dried, it's got a little bit more concentrated flavor. And I guess people like that concentrated flavor. What does abalone taste like? So I guess it can be described between a cross between scallops and foie gras. So abalone has a chewiness and a distinct saltiness of the ocean waters that it sits in, and it has a rich kind of buttery finish. So personally, for myself, what I like is the texture of abalone, and when I eat an abalone, that's what I'm looking for, the texture. So you don't want it to, you want to kind of have some elasticity to it, but you don't want to be so hard that it's chewy. So you want a little bit of texture that's slightly chewy, but not so chewy that you can't kind of eat through it. Very similar in terms of like steaks, right? If a steak is overcooked, it's going to be dry and it's going to be very hard and chewy and hard to eat. If a nice, well-cooked steak, it's going to be very soft, almost, in the case of Wagyu, it's going to melt in your mouth, but it still have some texture. And that's really kind of the same way I would eat abalone, almost treat it like a steak. And a lot of people do eat abalone with a knife and fork. And so you kind of treat it in the same manner of a steak in terms of judging it. Of course, you don't cook it like a steak, like rare, medium rare, whatever, but the texture, what you're looking for is the same thing, that kind of little bit of texture, a little bit of chewiness, and kind of firmness, but not so chewy that, it's really tough meat. What is the difference between the different types of abalone from different countries? So first, let's start with the South African abalone, which is considered probably the best quality to price ratio. So they are very distinct, fresh. They are very rich and flavored and have really good texture. They weigh more and are darker in color than other regions. And so as compared to Japanese abalone, which is more yellow, golden yellow in color, and they're more chewy, and they have a smoother texture and a stronger aroma than South African abalone. Australian abalone, lighter in color, smooth in texture, and they're sweet in taste and a little bit more tender in terms of the meat. So everyone kind of has their different choices. And again, we go to farmed abalone, which is going to be much milder in terms of taste, but much more accessible and I guess more environmentally friendly and sustainable. How is abalone eaten? It's eaten in a number of ways. Even now, North American restaurants are picking up on abalone. It's eaten in Japanese style abalone. It's eaten in sushi or cold. I've seen it also used in Chinese cooking. I had it as an appetizer where it's cut up like a steak as an appetizer. Cold, that's a really neat way of doing it. But traditionally, it's either used boiled in soup, the smaller abalone, or if a larger abalone is served as a course with a lot of sauce. And that sauce is usually the broth. It's been boiled for many hours in a certain broth to give it a certain flavor. And you'll see that quite a bit. And that flavor, that texture is kind of a secret, and that's a special sauce, or that's the kind of what makes certain restaurants famous. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Hope it's been useful. And until next time, happy eating.